Safety, if we could go back one moment to page 3. I understand everybody's had a chance to look at the proposed trailer bill now, and the motion as it stood was Senate P. Wise with the modified trailer bill language. I think that's now a 5050. Everybody happy? Okay, 5050. Page 3 is closed out. All right, public safety. Page 1, judiciary. This is Senate trailer bill language, LAO.
Drew Soderborg, Legislative Analyst's Office. The proposed language specifies that counties not be penalized by auditors for failing to remit $1.50 from parking revenue to the state between 2008 and 2009, as the requirement to do so was an unintended consequence of an unrelated public safety omnibus bill in 2007.
So it's my understanding is sort of like forgiving a debt, basically. Finance?
Yes, Jennifer Osborne, Department of Finance. This language was actually part of a package that was prepared by the AOC and CSAC that would kind of address a number of issues in the court system, and one of them was that this thing was inadvertently, I guess it was chaptered out, and so this would basically just prevent the potential audit finding for the fact that these counties hadn't remitted this
for the back.
Fee. Right.
But on an ongoing basis, they've now straightened it out. They're paying it into a fund. It exists. Is there any objection to the Senate version?
We'd like to hold this open.
You want to hold that open? All right. Assembly wants to.
I'm just curious. There's like
Senator
3 counties that did pay it, though. Is
I
that
think
what
there were a handful that paid.
I see.
So, in fairness to them, what do they get out of the deal?
Fairness?
Well,
They-
gold
I mean, you
star
got
They
3
don't
out
have
of
the
58.
potential
I
audit
mean,
finder.
for
I
compliance.
ought to give them an attaboy or something. Is that what we're going to?
Yeah, something. Extra piece of the block grant. All right. I don't know. All right. We'll leave it open for a moment. Maybe we could find out which counties those were and see if we make a settlement with everybody here.
What do we do
All
with
right.
it?
Page 2. Mr. Blumenfield moves the Senate version. Hearing no objection on a 5-0 vote, that will be adopted. Page 3. Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Keith Geminder with Finance. Budget bill language was adopted to prevent CDCR from reducing funding to rehabilitation programs in 2010-11. This was associated with a $50 million reduction to a population request. We support the Senate. The language as it's written we think is unduly restrictive. It doesn't just pertain to the $50 million. It pertains to any reduction. And CDCR has a $195 million workforce cap reduction that they have to come up with next year.
Yeah, but last year you took it all out of rehab. I think that's the point here. And nobody wants to see you do that again because you'll never get the rest of the savings here.
Well, last year, a $175 million reduction was specified to rehabilitation programs, so they didn't have a choice.
And the governor vetoed how much of that?
That wasn't vetoed. That happened.
The rehab cut was actually in the budget passed by the legislature.
There was one, but there was another one. The education piece, maybe. Is that what I'm remembering? There was a reduction in the budget as passed, but there was an additional veto, or else it was part of the unallocated cuts to go after the education funding and the rehab
There
funding.
was a $400 million veto in the early February budget, which then became the led to the discussion on the parole reform package. But as far as a specific cut to rehabilitation, that was 175. That was in the revised budget act, and that wasn't a part of a veto.
But then you did the veto that caused all the education folks to get fired.
There was an additional $75 million
That's the
reduction
one.
to rehabilitation. Yes.
That's the one. I knew it was there someplace. All right, hold on. Somebody else want to chime in on this? I mean, I'm okay with the assembly. Senator Leno, go ahead. No.
I'd say a good word for the Assembly version in that, is this accurate? About half of the rehabilitation program funding was already cut in the current year?
It was about one-third.
About one-third. So,
The part that was agreed upon in the budget, or the part that included the extra?
Yes.
Madam Chair, we're okay with the Assembly version if the language only applies to the 50 million.
Oh, I see. Okay, Mr.,
I thought that was the,
well, that is, but they just want,
right, clarification.
okay. Yes, Senator House?
Will we, I know that everybody wants to save this money, but will we be able to achieve that realistically? Because you're kind of hamstrung in this.
It will be difficult for the department to do. If it's included in the budget, they'll try to do it.
Yeah, well, try, but
Excuse me, I would just like to suggest
Wait,
there was an
hold on.
auditor's report that just came out a couple of weeks ago that could be a great roadmap for you.
The auditor found a lot of places CDCR could save money,
Huge amounts.
and none of it was in rehab. Mr. Nielsen?
Well, Madam Chair, we did have to take some hard cuts last year, but, I will argue a little bit this time around for some rehabilitation dollars. It has, in addition to, first of all, CDCR needs to do a lot better job in rehabilitation, and they're far from that. And maybe this would be a signal that they better get about doing a better job. And I think they can achieve their savings in some other ways. I hate to necessarily constrain them, but I think just for me personally, I would like to take a stand as an aye vote for the rehabilitation.
All right. I vote with Mr. Fuentes' amendment that it only applies to the $50 million. Going once. Mr. Huff is a no. Mr. Dutton's a no. Ms. Conway's okay. So 3-2 on the Senate side, 5-0 on the Assembly side. Page 4. This will probably be open for a while. All right, Finance, you want to try to explain how this could work and how much
Yeah,
cost shift to the counties you're anticipating?
We'll give it a shot.
LAO, maybe. Want them to go first? Or you want to go first? I'm not.
Paul
Have the
Gol-
LAO go first? Okay.
Paul Golozewski with the
Since they have the
legislative,
fancy chart and the pretty blue paper. All right.
with the legislative analyst's office. The handout that you have before you summarizes the issue for you and provides a bit of background. The governor's May revision proposes to require that certain nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offenders who are sentenced to 3 years or yet less in state prison would instead serve their term in county jail. And this would generate about $244 million in savings in the budget year. Now, starting in 2011-12, the administration proposes to give counties half of the state savings in the form of a block grant. Both the Senate and the Assembly approved the governor's level of savings. The Senate modified the proposed trailer bill language to specify that it would only apply to certain drug and property offenders. We think that the governor's proposal merits consideration for a couple of different reasons. We think that the idea of reserving very expensive prison bed space for the most serious and most violent offenders makes sense, especially in light of the state's fiscal shortfall. And we think that lower-level offenders could generally be accommodated better at the county level and have improved outcomes. However, we have a couple of concerns with the governor's particular proposal. Number one, under the governor's proposal, certain inmates could spend longer than a year in county jail, perhaps up to 3 years, and county jails generally are only designed to hold offenders for 1 year. Second, the block grant payments that the administration proposes to give the counties, we believe, could overlap with a separate state-supported funding program for probation. And thirdly, the administration is not proposing to give counties any funding in 2011-12 when the transition would take place. So as an alternative to address some of these issues, we would suggest that you consider another idea, which would be changing wobbler crimes. Wobblers are crimes that can be tried currently as either felonies or misdemeanors. And what you could do is for non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offenders, you could require that wobblers are only tried as misdemeanors. This means that offenders would be punished by a maximum of 1 year in county jail and or probation. In effect, this would be a subset of what the governor's proposing, and it would save about $215 million in 2010-11. We would also suggest that you consider providing counties with some funding in the budget year to accommodate the transition. And specifically, we would recommend perhaps a quarter of the savings, or $54 million, could be a reasonable amount to give them some funding to accommodate the shift. And then in future years, as the savings grow, you might want to increase that to up to a half, as the administration proposes. If you turn to the second page of the handout, our alternative approach would only result in savings of $161 million in the budget year, which is about $82 million less than what the governor had proposed. So we would recommend considering additional options. And if you were in any other way to modify the governor's proposal to make it more restrictive, you would have to come up with additional options to achieve the same level of savings. One that we think that merits consideration is restoring the general felon parole ratios to 2008-9 levels. The parole agent caseload ratios were reduced last year from 70 parolees for every one agent to 48 parolees for every one agent. And this was part of a change that was made to implement what is known as summary parole, where the department had estimated that about 34,000 parolees would be placed on bank caseloads. So the idea was to increase supervision for the remaining parolees. In fact, far fewer offenders are actually being placed on summary parole, about half of what the department originally estimated. So we think that you should reconsider the ratio adjustment that went along with that. And if you went back to the original 70-1, it would save $65 million. Another option that we have for additional savings is currently, under current law, there's a civil narcotics addict program where individuals can be civilly committed to state prison for addiction to drugs. Generally, there is some involvement with the criminal justice system, but they have not been convicted of a felony. We think that counties are better suited to handle these offenders through drug courts and residential drug treatment. And if you eliminated this program, it would save about $11 million, and we would suggest that you consider allocating some of the federal Byrne Justice Assistant Grant funds to support county drug court programs that could accommodate these offenders. And lastly, another idea that we have is you could consider releasing certain nonviolent elderly inmates from prison early. Research has found that criminality decreases substantially with age, and inmates over the age of 55 are far less likely to commit new crimes. And at the same time, they cost 2 to 3 times as much to incarcerate. If you release these inmates early, we estimate it would save about $6 million.
Madam Chair, before
Interesting proposals. Yeah, finance.
before we discuss the LAO alternatives, I want to take a little bit of a different approach on explaining what our proposal was. The premise of our proposal really builds more on some topics we've been discussing for the last few years. We had proposed, I believe it was $100 million general fund for probation services a few years ago. The end result was that Los Angeles County, Alameda County both got $5 million for some pilot programs, which are currently in operation. Last year, Senator Leno had SB 678, which further built on the premise that if we can provide some incentives to county probation, that maybe we can keep some of these 20,000 people per year that are failing felony probation from coming to state prison. Right. And so we do believe that if we can get resources to the county level to deal with these people that are failing at the county level, that we can probably have a win-win for the state and the county. And on June 4th, the LA Times had an article talking about one of their particular programs that kind of plays into both SB 678 and the concept of probation funding. And it's regarding a day reporting center in Los Angeles, to where just by having these people show up to a program every day, trying to find out where jobs are, trying to teach them to dress differently for interviews, that they're viewed differently. These are gang members. They're your typical, they're non-sex offenders, they're gang members, and they're seeing some incredible results. And so our premise was that we can't afford to just give the counties money. And so in order to guarantee that we can save the state money to get the counties money, we kind of went a step beyond SB 678, and we proposed the population shift. And so to some extent, we've kind of done SB 678, but we have shifted the risk of failure on probation to the counties by giving them the resulting incarceration. We think it's a policy from a public safety standpoint that works. We're seeing results from Los Angeles to now where county probation is now concerned about the pilot money running out. SB 678, I think, is a good model. our concerns with SB 678 is that the federal funds were one time. A lot of counties are cutting their base probation services. We're concerned that they won't take the risk to spend money and implement some of those programs. And so we think that we can actually help maintain what they've started with SB 678, and that we can actually go further and actually have them hopefully reduce the number of people that need to be incarcerated in total, whether it be at the state and county level.
Yeah, no, I think the goal is everybody's goal. The question is how to do it, and I think the felony probation does start a continuum. My question, I mean, I think we started 3 years ago, is are we still returning any parole violators to state prison? Because we shouldn't do that. Those are under a year people, and they're easily accommodated.
You mean as where they actually serve or whether they're allowable? Well, it's a mix. Some parole violators serve in county jail on the state's dime. Some still go back to a prison, depending on
I mean, it just seems to me that was always the first line of defense, was trying to figure out how to keep the parole violators, generally who are sentenced to less than a year, from being washer machined through the reception centers and back out.
Right. It creates a horrible process at reception centers, the churning. Part of the way to fix that was the reentry facilities, which haven't got going yet.
Which is a problem. Yeah.
Right.
But those were reentry, really actually people coming out 6 months early, not...
It was a combination of,
both.
transition and of
to...
parole violators.
But violators seem to me a better place to start than people who've been sentenced to 3 years on a new commitment. I'm intrigued by the civil narcotics question. Why would we be shutting down Norco, and then what would we have, a facility? And I mean, if we did what you're saying, I mean, it does make more sense. And you could put, although $11 million doesn't sound like much for that, OTP, you would have to put the money into OTP and drug courts to make it work. But
yeah, there's only about 900 offenders on a civil commitment. That's why the savings aren't too high. It would increase in the out years. It would roughly double to about 22 million. The entire Norco facility isn't just for civil addicts, so presumably
it's just a section of the Norco.
But without getting into the policy,
that would help you with the overcrowding. You could put other people in Norco for something else.
Well, or in order, if you went in that direction, and so without that policy, there are some pretty old buildings at Norco if you wanted to reduce the size, for example.
Well, I mean, I'm just looking for savings for you, or whether those buildings could be rehabbed and used for something, I mean, like we're doing with Estrella and those, turning them into hospital beds. I mean, it might help with overcrowding. It might help with reception. I don't know, but I'm just trying to think about the reuse. And if you took the 900 folks and you put them in their home counties in a drug court program, let's just say, as long as you gave the resources to the counties for drug Medi-Cal and OTP and so we have drug treatment available in the counties, which is a little dicey under the current governor's budget. I'm with you on the burn jag. Personally, if we can figure out how to get the CC, whatever that thing is that Kalima listens to put at least half of the burn jag money into treatment, I think that's important. And
I'll also add that you just mentioned a lot of the programs that we think that the half of state savings can go fund for county probation to make these people successful. Whether I think each county can, based on what who the offenders are in their county, can choose whether it's
mental health
or maybe a drug court program, et cetera.
It's the ramping up. I mean, I don't know where we all are on all of this yet. Members, anybody? Mr. Nielsen?
Well,
you're our prison expert.
The civil addict program, it's generally been an effective program in the institution. You're just saying that it could be done more cheaply in the community?
Correct.
Yeah. And with the funding, do you feel that the courts can handle this population in the drug court model?
Correct. We believe so. It's only, as I mentioned, a shift of 900 offenders statewide, so it's not a huge population.
Okay. Well, that setting aside, and I don't have as much aversion to that, but undergirding most of what's happened in the last 2 years is a fundamental shift of what are now state responsibility inmates and state responsibility parolees to becoming local responsibility. Even the move to the halfway houses, which foundered in opposition in the communities, is another such step. And I just have grave reservations about this administration proposal. The better way to go that I would argue is more of the summary parole or bank parole supervision, I don't like that because I know this universe is not rehabilitated. They will continue their criminality, and they simply will not be caught, and they will get away with it. But at least then you avail them parolee services if the agent finds out that there's some kind of problem with the individual. And you have the revocation hammer over their head. You have the carrot and a stick. In addition, the Board of Parole Hearings could go ahead, I don't even think with a new regulation, but I would advise them to do one on summary revocation, whereby you will then be able to put more individuals in programs than in custody, with the assurance that there's a consequence if they don't. They don't get another hearing. If, in other words, they go out on summary revocation and violate, then they just simply, bang, go right back into custody. There'll be no more revocation hearings, no more, not Valdivia, but Morrissey hearings. To me, that's a whole lot better approach than I think what the administration here is proposing. As a matter of fact, this non-revocable parole, it's going to end. It's going to end, and it'll only depend on how much blood is shed on the streets and how much burden is borne by the counties before all the fingers pointing starts and this ends. And I just do not think that that's a good solution, nor do I ascribe to the administration's proposal here. Further, the wobblers, you're getting into sentencing policy again, and the confines of a conference committee is not a place to debate sentencing policy. Those all have long-term implications, and they need to be very seriously considered in the long run. So, color me pretty resistant to the overall proposal. The so-called short-termers. All right, what's going to happen, in my opinion, is the local sheriffs are going to then dump out on the streets some of their capacity. A lot of them don't have capacity. They're under caps already, and they're not going to be able to take any more. Those who do are going to be vacating some of theirs and taking ours. I don't see the sense to that. And further, the individual are going to continue to reoffend, and more out on the streets means more reoffending. It's a long-term deal. You've got to have rehabilitation sustained over years and decades. You can't save millions and billions of dollars in corrections in the short run and ensure justice and public safety. So I see very little merit in almost any of this, and I'd like to see us go back to expanding that universe of the summary parole, add the summary revocation to that as a consequence and an incentive, and save what we can. But I do not believe these massive savings that were anticipated. In fact, last year when these large figures were proposed, I told Matt Kate, you won't save half of this. Well, I ended up almost being right on how much was actually saved. It was about half. This is trifling with too much risk.
All right. I mean, just I think this one requires obviously a lot of discussion, and the real issue is sort of how do we restructure this relationship between local and state to create the best public safety environment for the most cost-effective dollar. And some of the things we've started on the felony probation and some of the other things we've started are moving in a direction. I think there is more that could be done. The civil commitment one interests me, and I think there are bills moving, at least on the medical parole. I don't know about, we've had this debate about, you know, age 55, and there's too many of us here that are age 55 that don't think we're that infirm yet. To get there, yeah, that was a little tough. You know, that age keeps moving up every year. But it's, you know, but somehow we have to figure out what is the rational system. I mean, we've proposed in the past, I think, this notion of community corrections. Do we merge parole with, you know, what are the appropriate statewide roles for parole, and what are the appropriate roles that really ought to be done and could be done better at the local level? What we now call probation, but could be, I mean, it really is a merger of the two things. I mean, I don't know how they do those local contracts and whether, you know, parole services doing their contracts with the same drug treatment places that probation does creates some sort of spending that's unnecessary, that we could just contract once and put whoever we need to in there, regardless of which level they were convicted at. If they are in the community and they need the services, then somebody ought to be supervising it and delivering it. And if the reentry courts were supposed to be up and running yet, is that money out on the street yet? I know the courts all applied for it. Kalima was being a bit pokey about getting some of that money out last time I looked. Because the reentry courts were part of that same legislation last year. They were supposed to help too, because then parole violators can be sent to a court and get supervision similar to the supervision that's provided in drug courts or mental health courts, with supervision of services and the availability of local custody. And it seems to me that the local custody option, the other one that was kind of around last year and disappeared somewhere in the midst of everything was alternative custody for state parolees that is provided to local elected officials. Sheriffs have the ability to do alternative custody, but the state doesn't. And that was one of the proposals last year.
If I may speak to that,
Yeah.
You had mentioned looking at the system as one. I think alternative custody is a good example of looking at the system as one. Last year, our proposal was basically, the alternative custody proposal was a one-year kickstart to the Wildboro proposal. But we think one of the things about our proposal is that we are looking at the state as 250 cells. And if you start thinking about who should be alternative custody or who should be in program, then we think it's best to shift that to the lowest level possible, as opposed to having, for example, a state inmate on alternative custody, that we should be looking at having a county inmate on some alternative custody, and that's also an option in our proposal.
All right, well, let me see that. Senator Leno?
Yes, with regard to how this overlays with community corrections and SB 678, I think it's an intriguing idea that we give the locals an incentive to make sure that these felony probationers succeed. And in conversations I've had with stakeholders, they really describe what a significant shift this whole idea of keeping someone who is a felony probationer successful in their probation, that the culture is such that I'm here to kind of oversee you, but you're going to fail and you're going to state prison. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So this is really shifting cycle.
President, we're going to start this morning with the general government section. And the first item up is the governor's proposal for the Department of Consumer Affairs. And finance, we actually, members, our staff did a chart, partly because we were kind of going crazy trying to understand this proposal, that I think all of you have now. Does finance have one too? We did ours. This is all the different, we tried to break down the boards. What's the backlog? Are there fee increases associated with it? Those kinds of issues, so we could actually understand what we were dealing with. So we're all trying to figure out why it takes 5 years to process a complaint at optometry. Finance?
Good morning. Kristen Shelton, Department of Finance. The governor's budget proposed 138 positions in 2011-12 with a kind of a phasing in of those positions in 2010-11 for a total position count or PY personnel year account of 107 positions. These positions are needed to take the average processing time frame for complaints and investigation and prosecution of those complaints from 3 years down to a 12 to 18 month cycle. Based on our analysis of the proposal, we proposed a phasing in of these positions, recognizing that there's a number of positions being added at one time. The vast majority of the positions would not begin until October 1st, with approximately 8 positions beginning in January. We think that this proposal is basically appropriate in terms of how it's being brought in and when it's being phased, and that DCA, the Department of Consumer Affairs, has provided us with an achievable hiring plan to support those positions. Keeping in mind that this deals with 18 individual healing arts boards, there is really, most of the boards are hiring less than 5 positions. So while the 140 positions or 138.5 positions may seem daunting, it's spread across 18 individual hiring entities that can do the hiring, the screening process, and actually fill those positions.
So you're saying that you can do 107 positions in the budget year?
We're very confident that the department can hire 138 positions, which is equivalent to 107 personnel years, which is what was accepted by the Assembly, primarily because it's not as if it's the Employment Development Department trying to hire 300 positions, 500 positions, which they were successfully able to do, but it's more like a number of very small departments hiring less than 5 positions per department. There's only 3 of the 18 healing arts boards that are hiring more than 20 positions. That would be the medical board, the pharmacy board, and the nursing board. So the vast majority are hiring 5 or less positions.
But these folks have to have some specialty knowledge or something, right?
There are both generalist and specialist classifications. The primary specialized classification is really the investigative positions, and it's really in obtaining records, conducting investigations, how you document those investigations, and then making recommendations as it moves forward through the process. Each of the individual boards will hire people and train them in terms of understanding their specific code sections that they're working under, but they don't require specialized knowledge of the medical profession, for instance. They have subject matter experts that would be in helping give advice and that type of thing.
And is this Finance's trailer bill language or the proposed modified trailer bill language?
That is a proposed modified trailer bill language that the Department of Finance provided during the subcommittee process, kind of towards the tail end, that is really essential to be able to hire non-sworn investigators rather than sworn investigators, which are currently used. That's the trailer bill that's critical to be able to implement the proposal before you.
And all of these positions are funded from the special funds associated with the respective board?
Correct. They're entirely funded by the special funds of the various licensing entities. So there's actually 22 different funding sources that support these positions, and it's predominantly funded through the license and renewal fees of those people that would be monitored. Just for your reference, I know that the staff analysis indicates a number of fee increases. Those are largely triggered to on the natural they would occur, irrespective of whether you adopt the Consumer Protection Enforcement Initiative. The only fee increase that results as a result of this initiative as proposed before you is in the Psychiatric Technicians Fund, and they would require a fee increase in 2011, 2012. It would be about a 5% increase in the application or exam fee and up to a 30% increase in the initial and renewal license fee.
But they don't have any backlog.
This proposal doesn't take into account any type of backlog. It is really based on the workload that's before them, the number of complaints that come into the door. So while they may have a lower processing time than the other boards, they are still need to come down in terms of their processing investigation timeline.
LAO?
Russia Chavez with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Based on the workload and what the department is proposing to do here, their workload is justified, but at this time it would be something that the legislature, Madam Chair, that you guys would want to consider going forward with something like this at this time.
That's a little dicey. Mr. Blumenfield?
Question. Are other states also, do they measure their complaint time in years like this? I mean, it just seems outrageous to me that 5 years, 4 years for a complaint or even 3 years.
Right. That is the exact reason we have this proposal before you.
But how did it get to this place, and how are?
I think it was
how does it compare to other states?
Right. Our processing time is much greater than other states in terms of handling investigations and complaints. This is largely accepted over time because there were many handoffs present in the complaint investigation process. What we're actually doing here is we're bringing down the investigative staff to kind of the lowest possible level and putting them within each of the different healing arts boards, which will speed up that process. But everybody kind of generally accepted it. It was
it like this, let's
very
say,
much a
8
status
years ago?
quo.
Was it
Absolutely.
10 years ago?
We didn't go back that far, but we did look back at the last 5 to 8 years. And
So just this administration?
no, I think it was really the status quo that kind of was accepted as new directors came in, and I would say that Director Steger, as he came into the Department of Consumer Affairs, based on his experience with the chiropractic board, started questioning that status quo and began to look at ways to reduce that time, because it's not acceptable from a consumer protection standpoint to allow 3 years or upwards of 3 years to go by before a complaint that comes into the office to be resolved. This initiative gets it into the 12 to 18-month timeline.
Senator Dutton?
Yeah, I think actually, Senator Bloomfield, he actually touched on it, because it's been the process that we've had up to date. It's been kind of antiquated. A lot of the investigation, as I understand, used to be up to the Attorney General's office, and so the delay took place because there was a time delay between these various boards and the Attorney General's office in order to do the basic investigation that was necessary before they could take action on licensees. But I'm also wondering about breakdown between, the various levels of employees within these various departments. Anybody take a look at the ratio between like supervisor and staff versus exec to see if we're in balance there? I'm always kind of concerned whether maybe in some areas we may be a little top heavy. Maybe we don't have enough people at the staff level in comparison. Do you look at those types of ratios as far as making sure that we aren't top heavy and too many chiefs, not enough Indians, so to speak?
While it varies from board to board, the predominant workers within each of the different healing arts boards and across all the consumer affairs organizations are actually at quite low levels. They range from office techs that might do the initial intake of a complaint, staff services analysts, associate governmental program analysts, and then the investigators. And by using non-sworn investigators, it's far more cost effective and more efficient. There's a small number of supervisors. I believe we applied a 1-to-10 ratio. In terms of the managers in this proposal, which was largely consistent with Consumer Affairs, I would say they're not a top-heavy organization.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Nielsen and then Senator Lowenthal.
Just so that we're not losing personnel years to solve the problem. Endemic and historic situation in DCA. Protocols, policies, and procedures. Is someone really watching over and monitoring, and is there a real laser-like focus on the protocols, policies, and procedures? Because the staff alone are not the solution.
We completely concur. The department has actually already embarked on this initiative in terms of looking at the way in which they take in complaints and how they process complaints. They've established an executive officer at the Department of Consumer Affairs executive level to monitor. 8 of the positions that are requested and before you today are actually for a performance metrics unit so that they can monitor these boards' performance, make sure that they're implementing best practices across the Department of Consumer Affairs spectrum, and that they're being evaluated as they go. They also, when this proposal came before us, we suggested that they do an internal review and validation. They completed that. That was shared with your legislative staff in May, where an independent vendor came in and validated the proposal that they were seeking, the things that they've done internally already to streamline processes. So I think they're well on their way, and it's a multi-pronged effort, not just a resource effort.
Okay, on the sworn officer, now I'm familiar in government with inspector class. Are not most of the inspector class sworn officers, or there are a number of exceptions now?
There are sworn investigators or peace officer type